Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast. My name is Joshua Gibson. I am your host, and I'm joined today by Stu Martin. I'm not sure how many people will be familiar with Stu. There was a series of Instagram posts that I wrote up that kind of summarized and detailed a paper they worked on, him and a few other authors, on weightlifting technique. And the most surprising thing about that, it wasn't necessarily the quality of the content, the effort that I put into it, or the usefulness of it. It was that it got like 40 likes. And most of my posts of me just lifting weights casually will get 200 plus. So I was very disappointed about that. And that's Instagram for you. But before we dive into that paper specifically, which can help inform our listeners, you specifically, the person listening, on how you can improve and address your weightlifting technique if that's something you care about, let's introduce Stu. So, Stu, update us on how you're doing today, what you've been up to, and then we can kind of get into your background.
I'm good, thank you, Josh. Little bit of hay fever. Summer's finally arriving here in the UK, so my eyes are a little bit redder and smaller than they usually are. Is that for any viewers on YouTube? But yeah, no, I'm good. Just busy with preparation for the Olympics with the girls over here in the UK, and trying to lay the foundations for the Paris cycle and the work that needs to be done there to hopefully keep British weightlifting moving forwards from a performance perspective.
And I think I know what you do and your involvement with British weightlifting, but I could be wrong. Are you kind of the equivalent to, say, a Mike Gattone in the US, where you're kind of like the performance director? Or what's your position in British weightlifting and how are you involved?
Yeah, so very, very similar to Mike's role. I was over in the States, actually, over at Salt Lake in the training camp that USAW had last month with Mike, and we got talking, and we've got some pretty similar challenges, pretty similar things that we work on. My official title is Head of Performance, so very similar to Performance Director. We just don't use the title in the organisation. So yeah, it's everything from high level strategy, how we prepare athletes for games that are 2-3 away, all the way through to international competitions, and making sure that athletes and coaches have the sort of resources they need to get better and keep progressing towards the necessary standards. So yeah, that's kind of the short summary.
And I know that Mike also works with athletes. He runs the club Forza Weightlifting. He has, I think, an assistant coach as well, but he also has his hand in the development of a lot of athletes. Are you in a similar position where you also work with athletes one on one, help to develop them alongside of your responsibilities as the head of performance?
Yeah, so I coach as well as I'd say it's more of a hobby than it is part of the core part of the role. But I do coach some of our leading athletes. So Zoe Smith, Emily Godley, Chris Murray are some of the names that people might be aware of. I lead their training or lead their programs. They lead their training. I don't do that for them anymore. And then around that, yeah, I sort of work much more like Mike would with some of the other leading athletes like Sarah and Emily and so forth to sort of support what their needs are. So that could be varied based on the individual. They have personal coaches that sort of do a great job with them, and then trying to help them identify gaps and figure out what it is I can do to support them or find someone else that can. So that's kind of my bit around athlete development, I suppose, at the moment.
Okay, so obviously, as a coach to Zoe and Emily, we can kind of figure out what that means. But as someone who also helps athletes with other coaches, what does that look like? Because I'm sure it's the more eyes you include in the discussion of what needs to be changed, what needs to be improved. I'm sure there could be some conflicting opinions there. I'm not sure if you've ever run into that, but is it addressing technique? Is it looking at the program? Like, what actually do you look at and review to help the athlete and the coach, improve their performance?
So for the last number of years, we've not had a formal world-class program with with weightlifting in the UK. So the formalities of it are not. There's not much detail to share. What tends to happen is that we encourage athletes to build a support network, and just through casual, low-key conversation, we identify the gaps that they have. So a good example would be Emily Campbell. Coming into last summer, she had a bit of a knee injury, and then an operation off the back of that. So in the sort of first half of the pandemic, or first few months of the pandemic, sort of she didn't feel that Cyril's skill set was related to rehab, where Cyril's strengths lie and the things that he really does a great job of with Emily were outside of that. So she turned to me and said, "Is there any support you could give me in this space?" To which I said yes, and then we worked through a variety of rehab stuff prior to operation, and sort of I supported her through the back end of that rehab kind of period into about Christmas time, to try to build her back up to a point where she could transfer back over to Cyril as full-time coach and have him take back full control of what she does on a daily basis. Take Sarah as an example. My role with Sarah has probably been much less demanding. It's more or less been checking in, making sure that she is looking after herself, making sure she's find a bit of time to sort of go and do things that are outside the sport, are nice for her mental well-being and that sort of side of things, and just providing a bit of accountability by checking in and sort of making sure on some level that she is actually doing those things rather than just working as hard as anybody else I've ever met in her case. So it's really broad. I think we're as we gradually grow the number of athletes who are actually on some sort of formal program, in the next cycle there'll be more formal processes, but this cycle it's been quite a light touch. What do you need? What can I help? And we sort of identify from there. It's not a very sophisticated process, is probably the best way to describe it. So conflict, ideally we avoid conflict, because my view on it would be, I don't know, let's say for example I see something in Emily's technique, but we've agreed that she's working on a certain thing, or I know that she's working on a certain thing with Cyril. I'm just going to keep my nose out. It's not my business. If she asks me a question about what she's working on with Cyril and how she can approach it, and I can give her an idea or two that might change the way she sees it and help her to do the thing that her and Cyril have said is the goal, that's something I would entertain, but it would certainly not be a change or shift of emphasis or anything that could cause anything conflicting in terms of direction or alignment. So
yeah, I don't think there's anything less productive than when someone asks for help, to someone who isn't their coach or someone very close to them, and it's in direct opposition to what they're trying to do or trying to achieve, and it just starts to create a conflict. But I assume that you're very excited with where British weightlifting is and the recent performances, a kind of across the board. I think they've been representing the team really, really well. So is that implying there's going to be more growth in the program itself is going to start kind of I guess taking shape a bit more, given how they've been performing at Europeans, who's going to the Olympics, and just how they've been looking kind of in general, and the expectations at the Olympics, given how Emily's been looking and how Sarah's been looking, etc.
Yeah. So for those of you that follow British weightlifting, you might have seen about it's coming on about 9 months now ago, we were awarded a pot of funding by UK Sport, who's the funding body for GB Sport in the UK, to the amount of about 1.45 million, which is a good chunk of money that we can do quite a lot with, we hope. It was quite an extensive process to apply for that money, and it focuses on kind of three, four key areas of our strategy. So number one is changing the way we support athletes of high potential. So that's looking at a cohort of athletes who we think have the greatest potential in this country, and trying to provide some really high quality learning opportunities for those guys to, maximize their ability to prepare for Olympic Games and Commonwealth Games. Second is raising the standard of coaching. and so that one probably speaks for itself in terms of what that's for. And the third is then growing a broad and diverse base of talent. So, that third one is broken down probably into two areas: talent transfer, which is where we've had the most success at the elite level in recent years. Both Sarah, Emily Campbell, and Emily Godley have all come via that route, from slightly different backgrounds: gymnastics, throws, and pole vault, respectively. The three individuals. And we're looking to try and create a more formal process about how we do that, how we identify, how we then accelerate the development of those individuals across the first 2 years of their journey. And then the other side of that is the more traditional route, is how do we support the development of key clubs across the country, help them recruit large numbers of young athletes, and provide some safe and high quality environments with some skilled coaches that mean that those kind of individuals that come into the sport earlier in their journey are likely to be found, are likely to be developed to at least the minimum standard, and then hopefully move on to an international pathway at some point in the future. So that's kind of the key areas that we operate, or we'll be able to operate more and more in this cycle. In terms of what we hope will happen, well, we hope that those things will drive a greater number of athletes of a high standard in the pathway, and we hope that competition creates much of what we had with the likes of Emily Godley, Zoe, Sarah, and Rebecca Tyler a few years ago, when all four of them within the space of two categories battling it out, and as a consequence of that competition, you ended up with four women who all were some of the best in Europe at the time, and have gone on to obviously win multiple European medals, championships, World Cup medals, world medals in Emily Godley's case, and so on and so forth. So that's the ambition. It'll probably take at least 3 years to start to see the results of all that fruition, but it's an LA 2028 strategy, really. So hopefully we'll be battling you on your own soil.
Before we get into your background, which I think can help illustrate or at least explain why you're in the position you're in, one thing that's always been a difficulty for me is long-term planning, and that's part of that's programming, part of that's getting people ready for competitions months and months in advance. Or preparing the plan for the competition months and months in advance. And I think it takes a special kind of skill set to be able to project someone forward in, a year, 2 years, 3 years, etc. How do you manage having such a long-term vision and one, developing the now, the present, but also setting yourself up to have more medalists, a better program, and kind of meet the I'm assuming you guys have set a lot of goals, but to meet the standard or the goals that you have in place now, and to use whatever resources you have wisely. So how have you been able to develop the ability to do that? Because for a lot of us, long-term thinking is pretty challenging.
It's one of the privileges of being in the position I'm in, is that I can see it with that sort of helicopter view, I suppose, because when you're a coach on your own at the coalface, I suppose you're only presented with the people that are in front of you, and sometimes that doesn't offer as many learning opportunities as it would, say, for someone who can see it from above and can see the way that different people do things and so on and so forth. So I think first step is trying to get out of that bubble. That's just you focused on the people in front of you and actually seeing how it happens more generally. There's the what and there's the how within that, and I think in terms of how we've done that, or we do that. The what at the really high level is quite simple, isn't it? It's I want X athlete to win medals at the highest possible level they can achieve. And that only realizes itself over time. But, most athletes coming into the sport, unless they're, in their late 20s, early 30s, and they're maybe a little bit more realistic about their potential after the first 6 months of their journey and think, well, Olympics isn't probably it. Most of them are going to want to try and go to Olympic Games, if not medal at an Olympic Games. It's a fairly fundamental vision that most people have in their mind. The next layer back from that we usually explore is, well, what's that mission look like? What does that journey look like? What are the kind of principles that underpin it, maybe to some extent? We obviously want to do it the right way. We want to do it as a clean nation. We want our athletes to be developed as human beings, as well as just, as well as people that deliver elite performances. And we want them to enjoy that experience. I think that's often one that gets forgotten quite a lot of the time. When I think back on my own mediocre sporting career, there were a few things that I won, but largely the memories I have and the things that I enjoy reflecting on are the experiences I had, the times I spent with great people. They generate great stories, and I think that's what's really important for everybody to always remember when you look at things in that vein. The layer after that is where I suppose you get a bit more into the detail. You need to understand what it is that's required. So you need to look at the standards over the long term, and what the requirements are to win and achieve that objective that you've set at a high level. And then you probably need to look at where you are realistically now. What is the state of the country that you're in? What is the state of the club that you're in? What is the state of the program that you run? What does it actually generate? Not what would you like it to generate, but what does it actually generate? From there, you can begin to look at milestones. What are the things that are going to need to happen in order for you to achieve that final objective? And once you've identified those things, then generally you can start to explore how you're going to do it. So you can start to look at, what the various things you need to learn are, what the various things you need to develop are to achieve that finite objective, which is usually in our sport, obviously, the total required that at the end of your youth age group, at the end of your junior age group, at the end of 23s, 2 years after you become a full-blown senior, so on and so forth. So that would be, having some sort of matrix or criteria that you can follow that says, if I've achieved X, or the fundamentals to achieving X are, I must develop this performance behavior and this amount of strength and this amount of power producing capacity, and be this good at recovering, and blah blah blah. So you can sort of frame those things in a quantitative or qualitative manner, depending on the type of variable that it is that you need to achieve. I've tried to summarize that in a very short, succinct couple of paragraphs, but obviously it takes quite a long time to do that. The depth is obviously dependent on who you are and what your requirements are. If you're a coach working at grassroots level and you're looking to get someone to a national championships, the same thing applies. But it possibly doesn't take as long as it does as an NGB to explore it. Yeah. Looking out and finding out, once you've got those metrics, I think looking out and finding people you respect, who you consider to be experts, is the best place to turn to. And we always look at it as when we determine the what's, we try to sit down with the key people, the key stakeholders, and ask, what are the things you agree on? That's always a good place to start for me. Most people, there'll be some common ground, and that's the best place for you to start. And from that, you can explore what the grey areas are that you don't understand enough about. Ask more questions, go out and find more people, learn from that.
As someone who is involved with a lot of different coaches, a lot of different athletes, I'm going to ask a question that's a little more centered around kind of the present, but is there anything recently that you've learned or picked up that's gone against what you used to believe or used to practice or used to do, maybe in a coaching context? Because again, when you're next to coaches who are producing or will be producing Olympians and world medalists and European champs medalists, I'm sure there's a lot of great information, and I'm sure it's not all necessarily in line with your beliefs or ideas of what the coaching process looks like. Is there anything recently that comes to mind as something that's gone against what you've done, but you've kind of adopted as something you now do? It's a really vague question, but if you can come up with something.
It's a great question. Question. It's really making me think. really making me think. I don't think there's so much of a gone really strongly against what my beliefs are necessarily. And I think maybe that's down to my beliefs that you need to maintain a very open mind, a very open view to learning. I think you always have to have a core structure or system or process in your mind about the way that you do things. My philosophy is that you should never really change that whole scale based on one learning episode, let's say, to be a bit jargon, fill this conversation full of jargon. But like I always look at, like, I want to try and change like 5%. If I learn something new that I find interesting, I'm like, okay, how does that apply to my model of practice? And what 5% does it change? Or what 5% does it evolve? Maybe a better description. So when I look at it like that, I think the biggest sort of thing that stands out to me in the modern world of coaching, let's say, is the difference between coaching and instructing, and the relevance at the different time points in an athlete's journey. I would like to consider myself more as a coach than as an instructor, although I will obviously at times fall prey to instructing people rather than coaching. But I think you flip back and forward on that journey as you move into elite sport and you work with elite athletes. So if I take a sort of an example like some of the guys I work with now, who I've mentioned earlier, I think the point at which you start working with an individual on the journey is the key thing to remember. So if I take Emily Godley, who I've only really worked with for 2 years, Andy Callard was her coach before me, and Keith Morgan, her coach before that, at Europa and Crystal Palace respectively. My usual approach with an elite athlete would be that they need quite a lot of autonomy, that instruction should be a minimum, that they should generally be operating to a framework that you support more as a consultant than as a lead to that program. They're more of a lead. But inevitably, if you pick up an athlete who has a different experience, who hasn't necessarily been with you through their key developmental years, then I think you have to react as a coach to what they need when they begin. Almost that same process we talked about before. Where do you want them to be, but where are they now? And you always have to look at where it is that you want them to get to with your approach and your way of working. So, Emily is a good example of that. Emily's very used to having quite a strict and structured approach to training, being provided with what it is she's going to do, and most of how she's supposed to do it. So in that early stages, I think one of the biggest learned lessons for me with her was not providing enough instruction can have just as it can have quite not necessarily a damaging effect, because actually through that period she did quite well, but it does have its risks if you just always barrel in with your own philosophy and don't consider the history of that person, even if your philosophy might be appropriate for that individual in 2 to 3 years' time. I think you've always got to look at where they're coming from and training towards it. So not necessarily revolutionary, not necessarily against my views, against my philosophy, but certainly one of the biggest learned lessons I've had since working with an athlete of that standard.
How much are you trying to change the way they react and I don't want to say manage, but the way they interact with the person who is coaching them? So per your example, you said that she likes to be instructed, more strict instruction. How much are you trying to move people away from what you deem less efficient or inefficient? Or is it that people are somewhat of a mixed bag and you as the coach take kind kind of different approaches to each individual person. But you did talk earlier about autonomy and developing some sort of ability to operate on their own, to know what they think they should and shouldn't do, because the person who knows themselves the best is the person, right? So to tell an athlete that something's wrong or isn't correct can be misguided. So you have to use that information to kind of drive the training process. So how much are you trying to change the way they want or respond to training from the perspective of the coach-athlete interaction?
I'm always trying to make athletes self-sufficient, or 90% self-sufficient. And I'm always trying to do that from the basic principle that I mentioned earlier. So they're, as a human being, they have a need after sport to be 90% self-sufficient with the support of key individuals around them, in my view. Now, I know that in other countries that's not necessarily as applicable, but if you take our current circumstances, or the circumstances England or UK has had for the last 4 years, there has been no mechanism of support. So also no formal mechanism of support, no wages, no anything of that nature for athletes. So I think that was forced upon a lot of them, and in a sort of sink or swim way. And we were lucky that at least 3 or 4 of them swam with it. And so I think that reinforces the importance of that. But also that happens at the end of an athlete's career. And too often you see, or in my experience, too often you see athletes put all of their eggs in that basket and not want to talk about what happens afterwards, because they're very, very committed to their objectives. They cannot imagine not succeeding. And I think that's quite common. They're often very reluctant to plan for what happens after as a consequence of that. But it doesn't mean you can't necessarily help them develop the skill set they'll need to cope with that after the fact. So I think we generally, as coaches in any sport in the modern world, especially in the West, where sport is increasingly amateur, or Olympic sport is increasingly amateur for the large majority of individuals you work with, you have that responsibility to prepare them with the skills that they need to leave the sport, not just be in the sport. And there are obviously, that's one of those skills that I certainly believe has transferability in the sport and outside the sport. So it's a critical one to help them towards. I generally find as well that athletes who understand their performance better and actually embrace that sort of autonomy and ownership will generally be able to construct the sort of method of training that they need to be better. So that's something that Emily Campbell, I would say, is fantastic at. You know, her and Cyril's working relationship as an observer is a really interesting one to watch, because, you know, Emily respects Cyril unbelievably, but she is certainly, I would say, the leader in terms of the choices she makes. And you can see that in the way that the two of them work. Cyril is, like I said, she very much respects him and the advice that he provides and the knowledge that he has. But at the end of the day, the final decision made will almost always come down to Emily. He allows that, he encourages that, I think. And that means that she is continuously making progress, continuously understands her areas of strength and weakness, and how to put energy into the right things at the right times, to make sure that she delivers the performances she continues to deliver so far. It also means that she's not just contained to just Cyril's knowledge base. She can tap into what knowledge I have, or what knowledge her physio has, or what knowledge her nutritionists, psychologists, agents, peers and training partners, everybody and anybody in the sport that helps her to sort of evolve. But again, you know, not necessarily in an overly fluid manner where, you know, every new piece of information has to be done today. It's a clear, methodical. You should take it back to Cyril. They'll have a conversation. So I think that would work, but maybe we'll wait until this point or that point, and that's sort of that's sort of how that relationship manifests, and I think that's really important to cultivate.
And you always hear people talk about the ways that Russia or other Eastern European countries would um, kind of filter children and adolescents, teens through a program, ultimately getting to a different point um, with coaching and with what they provide to the athlete. And you mentioned how it's more amateur in the West. As programs develop, right? The USA is developing and becoming a lot more of a well-respected powerhouse in weightlifting. Obviously, British weightlifting is, developing along a similar path. As things change, as the systems change and become more formalized, as people want to get kind of pushed into this system, or maybe they don't, but how do you see that changing the way coaches and athletes interact, assuming that it grows to be something much more than just recreation, much more than just, well, we happen to get other talent from other sports, but we're actually developing people from the ground up, from 10 years old, 11, 12, and creating a system of producing high level talent. Do you see that informing the way coaches and athletes interact, or do you think a lot of this will be maintained? It's just the process of talent identification and development will change.
You're good at asking questions, Josh. I like it. I think the philosophy that people love to use the term athlete centered.
Mm,
I hate to use the term athlete centered. I don't know why. It just seems a bit fluffy to me. But um, inevitably, I suppose it is the correct phraseology. People want to have people in at least in my experience of Western culture, people want to have autonomy and choice,
mm,
and to ignore that in our culture and try to apply a rigid long-term athlete development system based on a culture that does not correlate would be very short-sighted in my mind. Um, so I think the good work done by some of the guys that we have support from in the sport, like Sham, who's sort of the lead author on the paper that you mentioned earlier, and really the one that should take most of the responsibility for the work on that, if not all the responsibility, really. Um, the sort of work he's done around talent ID, etc. Sean Joff, who was the previous S&C or strength scientist for British weightlifting, that all informs our understanding of athlete profiles.
mm,
And I think understanding those profiles is a really critical step. It's what your start point needs to look like is essentially what we're trying to identify from an athlete profile. In terms of how you build the system around that, I don't think we're probably a million miles off. I think the question is which bits that we do are necessary and need to become consistent across every coach and every club who we engage with, or we signpost an athlete who has the appropriate profile to. I think that's the big piece of work we've got to do, is being systematic in the way that we work, having consistent principles across coaches in the UK, so that an athlete is always going to get a basic fundamental education with no gaps missing, so that there's so that there are no major gaps and flaws in an athlete's performance when they reach the senior international level. In some ways, I always like athletes with gaps, because that for me is an opportunity for progress. Anytime you see an athlete who's not good at something, you're like, if I get that right, we're going to see some gains, and that's going to make them feel more confident. That's going to make me look like I know what I'm doing, which is, I guess, part of being able to spot it and do something about it. And I think often, as I mentioned before, that framework of how people make their decisions on what is important to work on is one of the things that maybe we lack a little bit more in the West. How we do it, I think we maybe already have the fundamentals of how we do it to some extent reasonably well, but I'm not sure we have the framework, and I'm not sure that framework is flexible enough to evolve, to sort of adapt to the different individuals and the different culture and the greater level of autonomy and choice that athletes and coaches have in this in the US and in the UK. So it's a really complex, in some respects, it's a really complex task. In other respects, it's not. It comes back to, again, probably what we said before, identifying what people consistently agree on and what you can see consistently happening across all the elite coaches in the UK, or all the coaches who work with elite athletes in the UK, or all the coaches that work with elite athletes in the States, is probably our best place to start for that framework. And then, figuring out what they don't agree on is probably where we figure out what the individualizations are that we need to create a little bit of bandwidth for, so that people actually want to exist within it. Otherwise, you're just going to get, if it's too rigid and brittle, people are just going to break free of it and wave goodbye into the sunset, and then you've got nothing systematic, and you probably end up back where we were, probably back where the States was maybe 10 years ago. And admittedly, my history of American weightlifting not great, certainly not over years and Seb's, and where the UK was maybe 4, 5, 6 years ago. We're just coming out of now, I think.
So it seems like, and this is something I've heard echoed in other strength sports, but the difference is that people in the West need a rugged individualization, and that's almost what's required because of the variation in athlete profile, because of the variation in, well, I guess athlete profile encompasses most of it: age, training history, strengths and weaknesses, like body types, etc. That all informs the programming and prescription of technique. The programming and prescription of technique doesn't inform the athlete, or it doesn't select for the athlete. So that's kind of the difference. And that's where I think a lot of the difficulty comes in when people start adopting a system wholesale. So you kind of see this in the US a little bit. People buy into the kind of like Chinese methodology, if we want to call it that, and then they adopt that system wholesale, and that's great, and I'm sure it's going to work for people, but it's missing the boat. It's kind of missing the point of, we get a variety of athletes, we get a variety of people who walk through our doors. You have to have a ton of different tools to solve a ton of different problems. Trying to shoehorn them into this one way is probably a fool's errand. Is that kind of the theme for us in the UK, in the US, trying to ruggedly individualize our approach to developing weightlifters?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's a good summary of it. I mean, we are fairly well. You just used China as an example. I would not want to be ignorant and make the assumption that they don't have diversity ethnically, but I think they certainly appear to have a profile that also includes anatomy to some extent. So, and certainly the way that the story is told, they look for certain anatomical attributes, let's say, for sake of argument. We don't have that privilege, so our profile has to look a bit broader. So, for example, we're more or less, if an athlete demonstrates high power outputs on an isometric pull of some kind, regardless whatever position that we think is most relevant or appropriate, as a talent ID metric, produces massive amounts of force, moves pretty well, and seems to have a good level of commitment, then we're going to probably try and take that athlete somewhere. But as you mentioned before, we don't know everything about that athlete's journey, and that athlete's journey so far is certainly going to have shaped their strengths, their weaknesses, and their profile. Contrast that with China. If you're selecting out of school, and we know that they work with kids from 6, 7 years old, if they're looking for certain anatomical qualities in a 6, 7-year-old, which I wouldn't even know where to start with that sort of level of detail, then you can have a more rigid system, right? Because you just pigeonhole everybody. You look for all those people that have those qualities you want, you stuff them into a pipeline, and the strong survive. That's what the Bulgarians did as well, by all accounts, but maybe slightly less detail on the profile around. And that's me, but more plenty of detail around how business was done, and if you could survive it, then you were going to be good. And that was, fundamentally the sort of success factor, wasn't it? There, I believe, to some extent, along with the obvious. So yeah, I think you have to have a profile. You have to have some understanding of what you're looking for in the West, and you have to have a reasonably good understanding of where you're taking them. But if it's sort of a funnel or a tunnel, then we're certainly looking at a funnel, right? We're not looking at a narrow bandwidth. We're saying we know what to do. We're saying people in this region we think can get to here, and we have to let them explore and move down that funnel, and the ones that have got the best potential are going to end up down there being the best performers. And I think when you describe individualization, I suppose there is only so much bandwidth for individualization, in my opinion. There are still fundamental things that almost every good weightlifting program is going to include, right? And when I say good, I mean specific. You're not a weightlifter if you're not snatching and clean jerking full lifts at least once a week, in my opinion. And that'd be, my minimum criteria would be if you don't snatch and full clean jerk once a week to some extent, then you're not practicing the full competition skill. And therefore, how are you applying any learning theory around skill development? So yeah, if that was your fundamental program, it'd be you must snatch and clean jerk once a week. Other than that, don't care what you do. You can figure out what your individualizations are on a really broad level. That would be the most rugged, wouldn't it? I guess.
Well, exactly, and I think the paper again. That paper, I think it's weightlifting technique, an applied method of technical analysis, or something like that. But you guys talk about lifting, in very different ways to achieve the kind of the same end, but you're not going to start with the bar outside of your base of support, right? It's kind of the same idea with weightlifting. You can do a whole variety of exercises and positional work and loading strategies, etc. But you're not going to snatch and clean and jerk. You're not going to completely remove squats, given the correlation to performance in the snatch and clean and jerk. You're not going to get away from pulls. You're probably going to develop overhead strength. There are a lot of fundamentals. How that kind of takes shape is with the individualizing towards the athlete. So maybe some people respond better to behind the neck work. Maybe some people from the front. Maybe some people really enjoy bench pressing, so you don't remove that entirely, even if it has minimal transfer. And that's kind of where you come into the conversation with, what does the athlete want? What do they need? How can we blend those two things? Because it's not always this very strict definition of increasing force production within these constraints, and then expressing it on competition day in the form of a snatch and a clean and a jerk. It's what can I do to keep the athlete invested, interested, and then how can we tackle the weaknesses? How can we kind of further improve the strengths? And a lot of that takes some manipulation, but at the heart of it is weightlifting. So you can't entirely get away from that. I would like to talk about that paper a bit, given that we've gone on for a while without really getting into too much that I mentioned off air. But as far as technique goes, maybe we can start from the ground up, or we can kind of just take whatever approach you like. Let's discuss things that are stable, and this is defined within the paper as things that really won't change from athlete to athlete, things that are variable and we'll see differences from athlete to athlete, and things that are more like style oriented. So things they adopt as a way to present the lift, or the way the lift looks different from person to person. What's your approach to, I guess I'm trying to find a good way to frame this, but what's your approach to instructing or teaching someone the snatch and the clean and jerk? how do you go about it? And maybe you can kind of take this answer and run with it, whatever way you see fit. But maybe we can dive a bit into what you guys discuss in that paper.
Yeah, for sure. So I think there's three phases to learning a skill, right? So there's, and they're not based on any scientific literature. Apologies for anybody out there listening. Oh, what a load of rubbish. This is how I visualize them in my head. Phase one is education, right? So you must know what is fundamental. You must have a sound understanding of the sort of non-negotiable factors that are going to influence your ability to be effective. And by effective, I mean you can create the desired outcome, right? So in lifting, that is the rules of the sport and the rules of physics. So the rules of the sport are, we don't need to go into them, do we really? You know, the bar needs to be locked over your head. On both lifts, one ends up on your shoulders and the other one goes straight up there. The rules of physics are, as you mentioned, that the bar is over your base of support throughout the whole duration of the lift. If it isn't, unless it's less than body weight and you've got the physical capabilities to apply force to bring it back in, you're likely to be ineffective and miss the lift. So that's where that's born from, right? The variables or the stable components then that we have outlined, or Sharm has outlined in that paper that we have sort of observed and then validated a bit more scientifically, are then the things that consistently happen for every good lifter. So I can't remember to what extent, what level of detail the paper goes into, but if I use our level 1 and 2 courses and the framework that we use to deliver to coaches who maybe don't have any experience of the sport before, and we're trying to give them an education about how to educate others, we use specific landmarks in the body as kind of reference points, right? So base front, the sort of furthermost forward point of base of support relative to the foot, in our opinion, is the base of the big toe. So that's the recommended preset position we would suggest athletes assume when they're learning to beginner coaches. So we say instruct an athlete to place the bar over the base of the big toe, right? Because that first level of education is pre-instructional. At the same time, we were looking at reference points on the body, and we were like, okay, well, what could we get? People always talk about coach's eye, right? You know, or they do or they don't have the eye. And I don't like accepting those sorts of vague mythical concepts. I'm like, no, there's got to be a way you can help someone see something better without having to get some sort of like German analytic performance analysis system in place. So we were like, what are the anatomical reference points you can always see on a weightlifter from a lateral position? And I was like, well, armpit's pretty good. I think me and Giles Greenwood, who probably came up with the original sort of like framework for the BWL technical model a long time back before it's evolved, we were sort of like, what would be a reference point? Like front of the shoulder? Well, that doesn't really tell us much. Like, we don't want the front of the shoulder above the bar because that's very, very upright. We were like, what about the armpit? Yeah, that works. And then we're like, what about the rib cage? And we were like, we can't really define different points of the rib cage unless someone's got a really open suit and very defined ribs. So we said, well, armpit will do. So armpit is in our definition of shoulder position being over the bar, if it's directly above. And then, as we said, your sort of bar position being over the base of support is the frontmost point of the base of support that starts the lift. And that then continues, and we just continue to maintain those reference points. So if the armpit stays above the bar at the knee, we assume that you've stayed over the bar, maintain that back angle to some extent. If the bar ends up above the ankle, then we recognize that the bar has moved backwards from the base of the big toe to the front portion of the ankle, which then should be, close to the body, and when the bar is passing the top of the kneecap, that sort of stuff. So that's your, going a bit too much detail, but that's your level 1 sort of syllabus for our courses. And it's blacks and whites, like that, then that. The second part of that then on the level 2 would be, but there is some variation, because there is always, right? You can't always say that there isn't. So it's about then saying, well, the base support is this space here. and it can be anywhere within this remit. Outside of it, ineffective. Inside of it, effective. Shoulder, same. You could, with certain athletes, get away with saying that this point of the shoulder might be, so center point of the shoulder joint, for example, or front of the shoulder joint might be your bandwidth for determining if someone is over the bar. And probably interesting on that front, we looked at those kind of, what do you call them? Not old wives' tales, but those kind of traditional, all you got to do is stay over and finish your pull, because you hear that a lot, right? And go, well, how do you quantify whether you were or weren't? And that was why we started with that kind of concept. So that's phase one, is understanding those boundaries. And then phase two is exploring those boundaries and figuring out where it works for that individual. So that might be suggesting just nudge it back one lace. So nudging is probably quite a good word I often use in technical coaching. So I might just nudge it back when the bars come, before the bars, when you set your feet up, just rather than setting it over the bases of big toe, just place it one lace back, then another lace, and just fiddle around with that until you find something that's more optimal or more akin to that individual strength sort of ratios, etc. So that'd be your second phase. It's just giving a little bit of instruction, but letting the person explore what works for them. And individualization, I suppose, is an athlete having a sound understanding of what over time is leading to performance improvement. So in a technical sense, it's probably more to do with the work that goes around developing a technique. So it's understanding that there's a process to improving snatch, for example. Their optimal position when they've snatched their biggest weights looks like X, but when they go into new territory, that degrades first in X position. So, bar at knee, athlete then begins to lift hips, which the prerequisite to that is then back strength during first pull and concentric leg strength. So the strategy or solution for that individual is more, first pull drills and more isometric holds at 1 inch and more GHD back extension work, so that they are stronger in that position and can then see that technique progress at a higher intensity, not necessarily change, but maintain and stay consistent, which is essentially the main objective I feel when you're looking at anybody from a coaching perspective. You're always aiming for consistency. Once you're consistent, you can see where you're inconsistent, whether that's based on load or whether that's based on pressure or whether that's based on any other variable. I think that makes sense.
Yeah, it did. And I'll link the paper below, and it's a fantastic read. So if people want to check it out, they can, and they can get even more detail. As someone yourself who's worked with the best of the best elite level lifters, I made a few Instagram posts kind of during the time of Europeans, showcasing the differences in technique between, say, the gold medalist and silver medalist. One that specifically stands out was Toma Loredana and Toma and Sarah Davies, and the differences in jerk technique, right? Loredana keeps her front foot planted much longer as she splits back and tracks her back foot back, staying close to the platform. And then at the last second, she touches and steps out, whereas Sarah got a lot of airtime early on. So both of her feet kind of disconnected from the platform, got a lot of space, and she almost like jumped into position. And, you would say, well, one's inefficient, one's efficient. Yet they were separated by, a handful of kilos, maybe, and on a different day, maybe there's a different outcome. How much refinement and change goes into the development of technique of someone like a Sarah Davies or Emily Godley or someone like that? Because I think people get confused and they get caught up in elites being elite because they're perfect or they have the most efficient technique or the most ideal technique. And I always point out, I have a habit of doing this now because I think it's funny, but anytime Lasha is lifting and his coach Georgie goes over and gives them a correction, I send that to everybody because I remind them that even Lasha needs some adjustments here and there. Maybe it's just within that lift, maybe it's just a suggestion. Anton Pliesnoy, he was doing some pulls and he was kind of getting behind the bar at the top. So Georgia goes over and puts his hand on his back to keep him from leaning back at the top. So I sent that around too. So there are adjustments and changes that happen. And we see that even the best of the best need to refine their technique. But how much do you think goes into the development or further refinement of the technique of, say, an Emily or someone like that who, people would think, well, she's got to have great technique or perfect technique. She's medaling at these major competitions.
So maybe if you start right back at the beginning, really, I'll be really quick through it, but you start right back at the beginning. When someone first starts the lifts, they've got massive variation between every attempt, right? So every lift looks a little bit different. And research studies into skill acquisition show that when the bandwidth of variation between each lift is high, the individual is learning at a really high rate, right? And gradually over time, the number of the consistency of those reps reduces. And then you end up in a position where, I suppose, talk a little bit of like profile, that intermediate stage, an athlete has a consistent technique, not an optimal technique, but a consistent technique. At that point, then that technique has generally ended up being what it is based on what the athlete's strengths and weaknesses are inherently, or based on their experience, their journey so far. So that second phase then for me is about trying to minimize the general strengths and weaknesses that individual has, or the difference between, or the distance between those strengths and weaknesses, at which point you probably get somewhere close to optimal. When you get to that elite level, and you do that by logical decision making, right? So use your best instinct. I think Mike Gatone often references Christoph Kipp, who did a study on the things that good lifters consistently do. So, for example, they maintain a consistent back angle in the first pull. They minimize the amount of deceleration in the second pull, so on and so forth. At that elite level, then, you're probably likely to find, in my experience, that an athlete's technique is very consistent and stable, and the only thing that's likely to influence it is going to be long-term commitment to physical change. And if you take a Sarah or an Emily, I'll take an Emily because I understand, or I've worked with Emily. I haven't worked with Sarah necessarily on technique. There's two ends of the spectrum I think you can improve really at that point. One is intent, like just generally how they approach the barbell, how hard they pull, how much effort they apply to it. And that's just, the general, come on, hurry up, come on, put a bit more effort in, the right times, and maybe communicating when that needs to take place. And then ask them to be more consistent with that as the intensities increase. Then it's postural. So I think the majority of work I do with Emily on technique is probably, you wouldn't necessarily term it technique work. It would be strategic, long-term, based on what I'm seeing as the key limiting factor or the first fault. Let's say start position, bar always rolls away because she doesn't have the back strength to hold shape as it separates. Like, right, well, what's the strategy that we need to implement to do that? So we do a lot of work then to probably work on those things I mentioned before, to use the same examples. And we want to raise the capacity of her back strength by 10% in order to help her maintain that through the lift. Take Chris Murray as an example. Again, has got fairly consistent technique at this point. Take his jerk, something we constantly put energy and effort into. One of his biggest limiting factors biomechanically is his overhead mobility. So, we have to apply a large amount of effort to, keeping his lats loosened off and increasing his shoulder stability overhead. And it will probably take a few more years before he's really able to realize his potential, because that's just his biomechanical limitation. It's just his natural thing that maybe his body doesn't like so much about weightlifting. And I think when you get to that elite level, those things really uncover themselves. Whereas earlier part in the journey, it's just your journey so far hasn't given you that skill. Later on the journey, it's your body is not designed for that bit. So what can you do to compensate for that lack of something? And what else needs to be stronger to deal with that limitation that you aren't likely to get around? So that's probably the difference, I'd say, when it comes to high-level athlete technical training. Mostly physical, and it's mostly based on if you've done it right up until that point, their biomechanical weaknesses rather than their just general profile.
So it's kind of that same idea that when you watch Liu Xiaojun and Li Dian and Shi Ziyang and all those athletes lift, they're doing heavy pulls. And I assume it's kind of the idea that they're mostly limited by back strength and their ability to maintain like a tight position over the bar as they're pulling. Less so than technique or well, it's kind of directly related to technique, but less so than like actual technical inefficiencies or leg strength. I mean, they all have a surplus of leg strength, but it's more so their back strength because of the length of their torso in relation to the length of their legs. Is that kind of the idea?
Yeah. If you've got a good quality of movement, then the amount of force you produce and how you apply that force is going to be the most critical factor, right? So, it makes absolute sense. And actually, when you look at, say, I coach a guy who's he's sort of first generation British, but previously Korean, and has a very, very long torso, very, very short legs, same way. That is his fundamental limiting factor. He has such a longer lever length because of his back that he has to have significantly the ability to produce significantly more force or maintain that back angle than someone with a shorter torso. So I think those are the sorts of things that realize themselves later on in the journey as someone becomes more optimal. So you take your Asian population versus your Caucasian population, that you're likely to see some differences biomechanically based on body type and anthropometry, etc. So that would make perfect sense to me.
Is that a case for, and when I say specialization, it's more so biasing the training volume or the amount of training towards those movements which shore up like a biomechanical kind of I hate to say weakness, but inefficiency. Is that something you would do from the intermediate stage on? Like, when do you start seeing this change in training? A good example of this is I have a girl who's got incredibly strong legs, and we kind of reduced squats down to 1 day a week and she just front squats 1 day a week to work on the rack position and kind of the strength in that, and with her hands in front of her and elbows in front of her, and her squat's still improving. And her upper body is kind of the limiter at this point because she carries so much mass from the waist down. Is that something that you look to address as quickly as possible, or is it something that you let again kind of just I guess maintain itself until they become more elite? Like, when do you start preferencing the training towards something like biomechanically this is the limiter, therefore more training should go towards that?
So I suppose we're just sort of verging on that conversation about programming now, aren't we, really? And so I guess to start again from the beginning, that initial stage of a training program for an athlete, for me, it's going to focus on the fundamentals. The things you spoke about already. Snatch, full. Clean and jerk, full. Pulls, probably dead pulls rather than dynamic pulls. Back squats, front squats, push press, press. And then probably a bit of core work, because we know that, there's a pretty key. We don't want to get much energy leakage, and we don't want to end up someone that can do all that stuff but has a brittle back that's going to fry them pretty soon in their journey. Maybe some plyometrics at really base level, just so they can jump and land. So fundamental movement skills plus weightlifting fundamentals. I just want them to do those things for a period of time. I want them to get themselves a consistent technique across those variables. I'm not really concerned what the ratio of those things to each other is in that first six to 12 months quite so much. I just want them to challenge themselves, work hard, enjoy the sport, and develop a commitment to the training. Once you go past that point into the sort of novice intermediate stages, I suppose you start to play around with some sort of framework, like how you make your decisions. Now, I just use basic, maybe better ways, maybe more effective or accurate ways, but I, through that period, then tend to just use strength ratios as a good way to create balance across an athlete's development. So, without going into the great depths of that, I look at that as my prioritization strategy. Somewhere in between that, I'm probably going to gradually introduce those things. And the way that I introduce those things is from hang to power to block, for various reasons, but we could probably be here all day if I went into all of them. So that's the way that I introduce those derivatives. For the jerk, I introduce it power, then they're all the push press, but power, then rack, then block in the same way. Once you've gone through that for a couple of years, and again, you've got them through that sort of like sticky period at about 3 years where people start to hit a point of diminishing returns and go, the progress isn't coming quite as quick as I would like it to anymore. I can't just try a new exercise and I get better at it. Do I want to keep doing this for the sake of a couple of kilos on my total, or a couple of kilos on each lift, each cycle, blah, blah, blah. I think that's when you get to the point where you begin to build a picture of what drives an athlete's individual performance. So I suppose you could categorize that as the middle end of intermediate. I would generally look at beginner 6 months, novice 6 months to 2 years, intermediate 3 to 5 years, advanced 5 years to 8 years, elite 8 years onwards. So I guess, through that intermediate phase, you're developing, you're using those lifts to right or correct some of those general imbalances. You're trying to get someone to be as balanced as you can, knowing that they probably won't be completely balanced. And then at the end of that intermediate phase, you then have a picture, is the way I look at it, of what, or a snapshot of what that person's profile might be, and what things might have a positive impact on their physical, positive impact on their psychological, and probably social and lifestyle as well, from a more broader perspective that we're not necessarily got into the depths of. And then you're trying to get them to recognize those features and learn to apply them consistently in a methodical way. So let's take Chris Murray as an example. He's probably coming towards the end of that advanced period, which is where I would want someone to have a really strong understanding of their individual needs, because thereafter it is hard and they need that method. So he, for example, if you take, I don't know, my classic, if I was going to just write a generic training program that included derivatives, which most of my programs do, block one would probably, if we were going to use any complexes of any kind to emphasize certain phases of times of the lifts, that would be there. Then they would move generally into hang work to increase their ability to utilize stretch shortening reflexes, and there's a bit of obviously additional back strength gained from hang work. Then I would probably move them into block work, and then I might use powers as a primer in the final phase of training. Chris, so that would be my logical sort of like approach, my bias to how I would develop an athlete through the various phases of training if they had complete balance. With Chris, I would completely skip out that block period, and I would keep powers in for most of the way through. I would insert hang snatches in the period immediately prior to competition. Well, I wouldn't, he would. And the reason for that is because Chris's lower back is not his strongest feature. So hang work seems to, in our opinion, maintain his lower back strength, which seems to be a limiting factor for him that if we remove, drops back down to its previous levels when we arrive, or by the time we arrive at competition. So we maintain that much later in the phase, and also it's an exercise which he enjoys and gives him confidence. Therefore, it makes sense to include. Around that, then we use that as one of our sort of metrics. Okay, well, if we know that about that feature, then, and we know what limits your ability to apply yourself to that feature, then the other work that we do around that can complement it. And from that, you've prioritized, or you've got a strategy which is prioritizing the weaker areas biomechanically for that individual that leads them into comp in the best shape possible. I think hopefully that makes some sense.
Yeah, it does. It was actually a fantastic answer, and I think this is good idea generation for a lot of people listening, and I know they'll probably get as much out of it as I have. Now, as we kind of wrap up, we've been going for like an hour and 10 minutes, and I don't know how long the attention spans of our listeners actually is, but the preparation for Tokyo, maybe you can kind of update us on how that's going and how you feel, 2 months out as of now.
Well, good question. How do I feel? I feel on edge. Obviously, anybody following the media will know that certainly the last couple of weeks have been pretty tough for the organising committee, and I know that we're all pretty sympathetic to some of the challenges that, again, potentially a third wave in some parts of the world is throwing up. UK ended up on the red list a couple of weeks ago for Japan, which is again also thrown up some pretty significant work from our International Olympic Committee, who we're very grateful for at this point, because they're doing a hell of a lot of work behind the scenes, which means we don't have to, and we can keep focused on the athletes and their prep. So yeah, it's tough times. I'm sure it's going to be a very different looking Olympics to the ones that we've ever seen before. But at the end of the day, it's also the culmination of 5 years worth of hard effort for the guys, which is something that you don't usually get. It's afforded us some serious opportunities with the likes of Sarah and Emily Campbell. The progress they've made over the last 12 months is significant, and it puts them in a very different position going into the competition that we would have otherwise expected. There are obviously a few challenges still out there. So the allocation policy is still going on until the 25th of June. We know that there are obviously some ADRV sanctions still to be confirmed, and that has an impact on the selection of, or the qualification of, some of our athletes. So at the moment we're just trying to keep them eyes on the prize, training hard, remaining as motivated as possible for something that's obviously not maybe entirely as the guys would have expected it to look. But we're incredibly proud of them. I think that's the fundamental feeling that I have, is that they, certainly 2 or 3 of them have had some pretty big challenges over the last sort of 18 months. Those that follow Emily Godley will understand hers. Same with Sarah Davies, Emily Campbell with her sort of knee injury that she's had to recover from. Those sorts of things are incredibly, show their resilience incredibly well, and I'm very excited to just see them out there giving it their best. I think Emily Campbell at this moment in time is in 5th, Sarah's in 5th, Zoe's in 6th, and we're hoping Emily Godley gets the opportunity. Right now, I think she's in 10th, vying for something to happen that gets her one more slot up and into that continental spot, which would be a really great conclusion to a long and pretty trailblazing career in terms of some of her achievements over the last couple of years. So yeah, it's been a pretty wicked journey to be a part of.
Yeah, we've actually, on the Weightlifting House podcast, spoken to Sarah. I'd love to get Emily on the podcast, Godley, to chat with her. So I'll have to reach out to her soon. Now, I don't know when you became involved, at least put in this position with British Weightlifting, but is this your first Olympic Games as kind of the head of performance?
It is, yeah. So I took over in a sort of performance lead role, although my role has recently changed its title, but in terms of the responsibilities, it's been pretty consistent. So yeah, I've been in the role 4 years. I mean, just after British Weightlifting lost its funding in 2017, Tommy Yule was the previous performance director, who was a pretty good lifter for GB. born into insignificance in comparison to the weights he lifted back in the day. But yeah, it's been a privilege to be a part of the program for the last 4 years, and the coaches we've got and the support we've had from people around the community has been great. Really, it's really very much a team effort. I think from grassroots all the way up, in terms of the people that have supported these athletes and helped them get to where they've got to. So even the states and sort of having us over to train and those sorts of things like that have been really really appreciated and welcomed. So yeah, it's been a good journey. I'm looking forward to it. I grew up wanting to go to the Olympics as a kid, different sport, but yeah, it's great to find him in a position where hopefully that'll be taking place quite soon.
I know we skipped over quite a bit of your intro as far as your athletic background, how you got involved with weightlifting, etc. I was just, the conversation was so good. I kind of got away from the stuff that is more filler content, and that's what I see that as. But maybe you can discuss quickly for us as we wrap up. Kind of the last little question is, what's the most impressive feat of athleticism you've done to date, or what are you most proud of? Just so people can get an idea of kind of where you kind of fit into all of this.
My most impressive athletic feat. I was a strong lifter. I wasn't a very skillful lifter. Probably my best description. So I back squatted 250, which I'm always quite proud of. My best snatch and clean jerk was 40-70. So not incredible numbers in the scheme of international weightlifting, but I think just finding the sport late in life and being able to commit to it for such a good portion of my adult life and chipping away and being committed to it for that long after coming from a different sport in rugby, which doesn't really have the same focus on skill development. Ironically, you'd think team sports and a sport like that would have quite a lot of skill development, but nowhere near the same level of detail that obviously you have to pay attention to in weightlifting. So I think just generally, yeah, my favourite physical thing to have done is just to probably been engaged in the sport and reached a level of potential which I was quite happy with. I like to think I could have probably gone on and done 50-80, but I like to think I also quit at the point of diminishing returns and took on a role which had a lot more benefit to me long term and hopefully the sport. So yeah.
Well, and I said that was the last question, but on the tail end of that, I know Mike Gattone was, part of the S&C staff for the Chicago Bulls, got involved in the Atlanta Olympics. Like, he's got this storied background. How did you get into the position you're at, given that you were a self-proclaimed mediocre weightlifter, you played rugby, and now you're kind of a staple in British weightlifting?
How did I come through? I was an S&C coach, basically. So my beginnings were quite humble. I did all the jobs on the way up, I think is the best description. So I did a summer internship at a professional rugby club, filling water bottles and being responsible for checking hydration levels, which anybody that's had to do that is not a particularly pleasant task. I then moved into, I couldn't afford to do that for very long because it was in the days when internships were unpaid. I moved into, a kind of, alongside that, I did a bit of personal training, which was sort of what paid my bills. I then moved into more of a rehab type role. Guess what you guys in the States call athletic trainers. So something similar to that with a combination of general public and like junior development athletes, university level athletes. Then I moved over to a university, took on a role as a head of S&C, working with kind of collegiate level athletes and young athletes from elite sports. So I worked with a number of the other NGBs, rowing, sailing, volleyball, and during that whole period, I was then lifting. alongside. In the days when there wasn't a weightlifting club for 2 hours around near where I was, and I didn't have enough money to pay for the petrol to go anywhere else, I had to teach myself a bit and learn my own way forwards. When I arrived at the University Bournemouth, I set up a club because I was fed up of training on my own. I built that club up over the course of, I think, 7 years, well, 5, 6 years actually. That club ended up, I think, topping or finishing second in the sort of British table in the last Commonwealth year in 2017. Before the sort of team for Gold Coast was selected, and that was probably the crowning achievement of my time down there. Obviously, alongside that, that then brought me some great opportunities to work with some really good lifters like Nurin Gulam and Nama Mardi and a number of others down at that club who really helped its development as well. So I just got a great fully immersive learning experience, I suppose, up until this point, and then thrown into the fire in a program that had lost its funding after 8 to 12 years of having it. Taught me a lot, and it's just helped me to, I suppose, prove my worth, hopefully, to some extent.
Yeah, I guess this is the most roundabout podcast you'll probably listen to for a while, given that we started talking about the topic and finished with the introduction. I guess that's just kind of the way it happens here. But as far as people wanting to get in contact with you, maybe for something similar, if someone listens to this and they say, hey, I have a podcast, I'd love to interview Stu, talk training, technique, programming, or if they want to just chat British weightlifting, if they just want to keep up with yours and Chris's kind of shenanigans on Instagram, where can they find all of that stuff?
You can find Chris rickrolling me most days of the week on Strength Coach SM is my Instagram. I'm not a big Twitter guy. I'm not a big Facebook guy. So that's probably the best place to get me. Or my email address is stuart.martin@britishweightlifting.org. So you can always drop me a note there if you've got something more pressing around weightlifting in the UK.
Yeah, awesome. And I really appreciate the time. For everyone listening, hopefully you enjoyed the episode, got something from it. If anything, it just kind of will continue to keep you motivated to chip away day after day and week after week to, eventually, I don't know, maybe become top of USA weightlifting or British weightlifting or some other kind of federation. If you like the podcast, share it around with your friends. Leave a comment, whatever. I know that stuff helps. I don't know how. You can find me on Instagram at Josh_PhilWL, and we will catch you guys next time on another episode of the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast.